They say the earth don't give freely. You've got to coax it, work it, sometimes bleed for it. My grandfather used to say, if the garden fails, the gun don't. Out here in the hills where money was as rare as mercy, families didn't survive on luck. They survived on each other, on root cellars, smokehouses, and soup stretched with squirrel meat and prayer. So how'd they do it? How did they feed 12 kids with no money, no power, and no store-bought comforts? They didn't just survive nature, they outsmarted it. Life before convenience, before freezers, before grocery stores. A kitchen might be no bigger than a chicken coop, but it held miracles. A pot of beans on the stove, cornbread in a cast iron pan, canned peaches from last summer's harvest. They didn't have thermostats. They had root cellars buried in the hillside where milk stayed cool and apples didn't rot. They lined the walls with stone, packed the shelves with wax-sealed jars, and let the earth keep its promise of cold. The homes were built like fortresses with thick logs, small windows, and tight seals. Every board had a purpose. Every draft was stuffed with newspaper or clay, and sometimes hair clippings. In those days, insulation was resourcefulness. Curtains weren't for show. They were lined with old quilts or wool to trap heat and keep the cold from creeping in. The scent of lard, firewood, and stew clung to the walls. A good kitchen had a rhythm to it, and the women who ran them worked sunup to sundown. There was no convenience food, only food that took time. Snapped beans, churned butter, bread that had to rise before it could bake. It was slow living, but it was real. How they heated and survived. Winter. The cold wasn't just a season, it was an enemy. Wood had to be cut and stacked by October, sometimes 12 cords deep. Kids would split kindling before they could tie their own shoes. Old cabins had no modern insulation. What they had was practical know-how and determination. Thick logs formed the walls, but even the best hand-cut timber left gaps over time. Families stuffed these with moss, clay, straw, or cloth, whatever the land gave them. Newspaper was layered between boards, and quilts were hung over doors and windows. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. At night, families slept close, babies between their parents, dogs curled at their feet, because heat was precious and wood was rationed. Winters started early and overstayed their welcome. Fireplaces were built large and deep, centered in the main room where the entire family would gather to stay warm. Bedrooms were closed off with blankets or left unheated altogether. People wore their clothes to bed, sometimes even boots, just to keep from freezing through the night. Heating wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. The women cooked on wood stoves that burned all day, feeding the fire with split hickory or oak. Men sharpened crosscut saws and axes with reverence. The sound of chopping wood wasn't noise, it was a lifeline. Food without a store. Corn was king. Beans were gold. Every backyard was a garden. Every fence post held up string beans to dry in the wind. Chickens roamed free. Eggs traded for salt or sugar at the general store. Hogs were raised all year for that first cold snap when it was finally time to butcher. Neighbors came with knives, kettles, and hands ready to work. And when the smokehouse was full and the lard rendered down, winter didn't seem so cruel. Every jar, every cut of meat, every ear of corn. They all came from calloused hands and shared labor. If you couldn't grow it, you foraged. Wild berries, poke greens, ramps, and mushrooms made their way to the table. Hunting was a way of life, not a sport. Squirrel, rabbit, raccoon, even turtle meat found its way into stew pots. What mattered most was that no one went hungry. Nothing was wasted. Apple peels became vinegar, bones became broth, and scraps fed the chickens or the hog. A good year meant you had food into the next spring. A bad year meant you got lean, but you learned. Because the next year you'd plant a little more, hunt a little harder, and thank God for every bite. And always, always, there was cornbread. Baked in a cast iron skillet until the edges crisped golden, it was the pride of the table and often the best part of the meal. Slathered in butter or soaked in bean broth, a warm slice of cornbread made you feel rich, even when your pockets were empty. Fried green tomatoes were a staple of late summer, crisped up in a pan of bacon grease and served beside whatever meat was handy. Come springtime, the morel mushrooms would pop up beneath the sycamores, and families treated them like treasure. Dipped in flour and fried to a golden brown, morels turned an ordinary dinner into a celebration of God's generosity. Outsmarting the heat, frontier cooling wisdom. In summer, when the sun baked the tin roof and the air hung heavy, they didn't reach for an air conditioner. They opened the windows at night, every one of them, then sealed them tight by morning, trapping the cold inside like a prayer in a bottle. Wet curtains draped over the sills, catching breeze and turning it cool. Tin foil behind the glass to reflect the sun. Heavy cotton pulled tight to block the heat. Amish homes used whitewashed walls, sloped roofs, and shade trees planted with intention. The thick timber walls held the night air like a vault. High ceilings let heat rise while cross-ventilation flushed the stale air out. They didn't just build houses, they engineered them to breathe. Cooking moved outdoors. Summer kitchens or open porches kept the heat out of the house. Meals were simple: cold vegetables, sliced meat, pickled eggs. Nobody fired up a stove in July unless they had to, and on the hottest nights, they slept under the stars, letting the wind and the whippoorwill keep watch. Root cellars, nature's refrigerator. Below the house, carved into clay and stone, was the root cellar. It stayed 35 to 40 degrees year-round, cold enough to keep milk from spoiling, dry enough to keep onions from rotting. These weren't afterthoughts, these were lifelines. Built by hand, passed down, through generations. No switches, no wires, just wisdom and dirt and cool, blessed air. They stored carrots in sand, hung herbs from the rafters, and kept apples nestled in straw. Jars of beans, peaches, and tomatoes lined the shelves like stained glass. The root cellar wasn't just storage, it was insurance. A promise that even if the snow came early, your family wouldn't starve. Some even used double-entry doors to keep the air sealed. Ventilation was key. Too damp and you'd get mold. Too dry and things would shrivel. It was a delicate balance, maintained with nothing more than experience, trial, and a deep respect for the earth's rhythm, raising kids for the real world. Kids weren't raised, they were taught, by example, by necessity. You learned how to split kindling, bait a hook, salt a ham. You learned that if you didn't do your part, someone else paid the price. There wasn't time for laziness, and there wasn't any room for pride. Because when the storm rolled in or the garden dried up, the only thing between your family and hunger was how well you'd listened. Children carried water, fetched eggs, and shelled beans while sitting on the porch. They learned to shoe-day before they lost their baby teeth. Playtime wasn't wasted time. It was often mixed in with chores. There was a pride in doing your share, in hearing your daddy say, "You did good today." By the time they were teenagers, most could run a homestead on their own. They might not have had schooling past the 8th grade, but they had wisdom you couldn't learn in books. They knew the land, the animals, the seasons, and most of all, they knew grit. Most kids only had one good outfit, usually passed down and patched up, known as their Sunday best. That was the dress or button-up shirt you wore to church or school. It was kept spotless, ironed, if possible, and stored away when not in use. If it got torn, it got sewn. If it got stained, well, you just wore it anyway. It taught them to take care of what little they had and to wear their pride on their sleeve, even if that sleeve had a patch or two. Why it still matters. These weren't backwoods myths. They were survival systems, crafted not in books but in barns, smokehouses, and gardens carved into hillsides. In a world where prices rise faster than wages and power grids fail more than they should, maybe it's time we stopped calling this stuff old-fashioned. Maybe it's just what works. We live in a world of instant everything. But when the lights go out or the trucks stop running, it won't be convenience that saves you. It'll be knowledge. It'll be knowing how to build a fire, cook from scratch, store food without power, and help your neighbor when they can't help themselves. The old ways aren't dead, they're just sleeping beneath the noise of our modern world. And maybe, just maybe, it's time we wake them up again. My grandfather didn't have much, but he had a house that stayed warm, a cellar that stayed cold, and a family that stayed fed. He outsmarted nature, and he passed that knowledge down one bean jar, one firewood pile, one long story at a time. If we remember how they lived, maybe we'll learn how to live again. Thanks for watching. Until next time, happy hunting.